Hi guys, and welcome to the Dread Paints channel and a showcase of my classic Warhammer Skaven army. This army is almost entirely pre-year 2000 and about 90% metal. And before I take you through each of the individual units, I want to explain how this army came about. As a child in the 90s, although the first game I played was Hero Quest, I was very much into Warhammer 40k, because that's what my friends who introduced me to the hobby had been collecting. But Christmas 1995 came around and Warhammer Quest was top of my list to Santa. He granted my wish and a new love towards the fantasy universe transpired. From this point, 40k was dead to me, and I wanted to collect a fantasy army that I could also use in Warhammer Quest as adversaries for the heroes. Skaven had not really appealed to me. They were a big commitment to collect such a huge horde army. Fast forward many years after dipping out of the hobby in the typical late teenage years way, and I was back and collecting Warhammer Quest adversaries once again from about 2012. Gradually building up a random collection of all the evil armies. Fast forward again to 2023, and by now my collection is substantial and the backlog is immense. I stumbled across the Middlehammer Tale painting challenge, which after some deliberation I decided I would enter and begin to paint the backlog of Skaven. But then I got carried away and just kept going for 2 years. So this army is a result of that project, and I'm proud to say is now done, I think. So let's jump into the individual units and I'll talk a little bit about each one. First up for painting, and therefore first in this showcase, is a unit of 33 Clanrats. They push a screaming bell that was painted a little later but is now a regular part of this unit, and so I've included it here. It's the only unit that contains plastic troops, and it was a good starting point to learning to paint rats. I decided early on the bases would all be of a dungeony, sewery sort of feel to fit the Warhammer Quest vibe. I also decided on all the lower robes being white throughout the whole army to contrast against that dark dungeon base. I also felt that learning to play Warhammer Fantasy would be easier if I colour coded my units, so with that in mind, these Clanrats ended up being a nice bright green. All the storm vermin were red, etc. The front rank consists of Gas Howler, the musician on the left, the Butcher, who is a Skaven champion carrying a cleaver with a hook hand, Mutan's Manflayer, the unit leader with sword and pointy finger, and Flair, the standard bearer. The rest of the unit are the 90s plastic chunky boys, who I thought were rather suited to pushing the screaming bell. The bell itself is quite a chunk, and I decided to mount it on a 60 by 80 base to make it sit nicely on the movement tray. In the army book, it depicts the screaming bell taking up the space of 6 Clanrats, but in reality it takes up 12. They obviously didn't plan for it to be quite as big as it turned out after the sculpting process. The Grey Seer is magnetised, as is the bell ringer, so he can be removed if required during the battle. I had big plans to add a banner pole to this originally, but ran out of steam with it and just added a couple of streamer type banners to it instead, which I think worked out okay. Next we have a unit of Clanrats, this time armed with spears and this time the metal variant. Throughout the years, some of these Clanrats were listed as slaves and then relisted as Clanrats as the range adapted, but with some consistent paintwork to tie them together, I think they fit together as a unit. It was also considerably easier to rank these guys up on the 20mm bases than the chunkier plastic brothers in the last unit. It's easy to forget how small Warhammer figures actually were during the 80s compared to the years that came after. Front rank from left to right consists of Warp Scream, the musician, Blight Packmaster, the unit leader, the spear and pointy finger, a Grey Seer with staff and warp-infused sword, a Warlord with sword and shield from the early 6th edition era, who I call Darkin, and the standard bearer, Steench, who carries the unit banner. Now we have the first unit of Plague Monks in the army, who are 20 strong. The main bulk of the unit is the Colin Dixon iteration, but there is a smattering of Jez Goodwin's original Plague Monk sculpts in it too. I went for Plague Bearer flesh as the main unit colour for these, with the red accents once again featuring here as they do throughout the army. The front rank consists of the pan-playing musician on the left, Spine Blightmaster to his right, a Plague Priest in the centre, Weird Banebreath, the unit leader, to his right, and the Standard Bearer out on the far right. This second unit of Plague Monks gets used more often, being a more manageable point size for smaller games. The unit of 15's colour scheme remains the same, but with the addition of some green hoods to keep it interesting. The front rank has a standard trooper out on the left who gets replaced with a BSB when needed, followed by a musician to his right. The unit leader in the centre, who is just an early Plague Monk I couldn't find a name for. To his right is a Warlock, who is sometimes replaced with a Plague Priest, and out on the right is the Standard Bearer, carrying the Plague Banner. 25 Elite Storm Vermin are shown here next, and I decided on my favourite of the Storm Vermin sculpts, Colin Dixon's classics from the Marauder miniatures. Unfortunately, Colin sculpted all of these with halberds or spears, which makes them incredibly expensive to field with the 4th and 5th edition army list, and so at some point I might consider finding a unit armed with swords to represent them too. I also split the sculpts up so that these guys don't have shields, to make them slightly cheaper. The front rank has a regular trooper on the left, which, like the Plague Monks, he can be swapped out for a BSB when required. Then we have a musician banging a drum, followed by a Warlock in the centre. 4th along from the left is the unit leader, and sometimes champion, and as usual the Standard Bearer is out on the right. Now stupidly, I have a second unit of Storm Vermin that took me ages to paint, and due to the reasons mentioned before about being expensive in points, means they probably won't see the battlefield very often. This unit has all the sculpts that allow for shields, to keep it simple to read on the tabletop, and is 20 rats strong. The front rank is the standard trooper to the left. I suspect you're picking up on a theme here, I'm quite consistent. The musician, a Storm Vermin Warlord in the centre, who can be a champion or unit leader when not required on general duty. A Warlock to his right providing the magic, and the Standard Bearer holding the Storm Banner out on the right. The bright red colour scheme with bright white robes and matching shields really pop out on the battlefield, and so these are one of my most successful looking units. Next up, we move on to the skirmishing unit of gutter runners. These were painted quite early on, probably June 2023 sometime, and I've been played with quite a bit, so they have suffered a little bit of chipping here and there, but nothing I can't fix one evening. I will also probably make a skirmish style movement tray for them, to save me handling them too much in the future. The cloaks were Ultramarines blue contrast with some highlights, the usual Blood Angels red accents. I opted at this point to paint all the trousers across the army in Space Wolves grey, which I think looks a bit denimy and isn't a million miles away from the original studio paint scheme from White Dwarf. Here we have assassins that are usually hidden amongst the units of Clanrats, Storm Vermin and Gutter Runners. So I've got 2 for each of my qualifying units here for a total of 10. One of which you might notice has got his fancy pants on. I use him in my games of Warhammer Quest to represent the character Skreek Deathstrike, part of the Quiric Laboratory scenario from an old 90s White Dwarf. The article also includes a painted example of Skreek, which is where I tried to copy the purple trousers from. The Oldhammer nerds will know what I mean. The original White Dwarf models depicted some of these guys with red drips on the sword, but I prefer the green poison type cartoony look, so I went with that. These guys have the Space Wolves blue jeans on like the Gutter Runners, apart from the aforementioned purple fancy pants. Slaves are shown here next, and there's not really a lot to say about them, other than they are practically naked, with the only splashes of colour being some sparse accessories and the loincloths, which aren't really a colour, just white like the rest of the army. The front rank currently has an untested lineup because I've not actually used these guys in a game yet. They were relatively recently painted, and I've just got so many more interesting units to try. I'm sure they would be useful in more competitive games, so maybe they will find a place in the army in the future. The front rank has Fresh the Standard Bearer, Warpie the Champion and the unit leader, and a slightly later what I would call 6th edition drummer. Let me know how you set your slave front ranks up in the comments below, fellow Skaven generals. Next up are the Plague Censer Bearers. I've got 8 of the Colin Dixon iterations on the left and 2 of the Jez Goodwin originals on the right. Usually anything more than 5 of these guys and they just get in the way of each other and the Plague Monk unit that they are with, which is a shame because they have proved very powerful in combat, being comparable to, I would say, Goblin Fanatics, but with a lot more control and maybe even a bit more bite. They certainly have decent staying power with the Hatred and Leadership 10, and with Frenzy making them killing machines. The Jez Goodwin sculpts play Plague Lord duties for my games of Warhammer Quest 2, so that's why they ended up with fancy collars. Here we have a unit of 9 giant rats assisted by 2 packmasters. Ideally this unit would be a touch bigger, but these 2 were painted towards the end of the queue, and by this point I was kinda glad to only have 9 to paint. I painted all the packmasters in this army together as a group in the same teal blue, although I can't remember which one now. So hopefully I'll never need to paint any more or touch them up. Another unit of giant rats, and 12 this time. They're the next generation, but still metal. They've got mutations such as spikes, boils, extra legs and muscly arms, which all look quite funny. Some have got glowing green warpstone pipes attached to them, which fits the whole clan moulder thing really well. I don't like the fur sculpting on these as much as the older style, but other than that, they are decent enough. I gave them 3 packmasters because that's how many I had left. And now it's time for the big guys. The real heavyweights of the army in both points, power and actual weight. I've yet to get a game in with these guys, but I will definitely be taking at least 3 of them to my next game for sure. I painted them a bit more flesh tone compared to the studio's very light, almost bone colour scheme, and gave them the usual army coherent white loincloths and red accessories. The odd warpstone infused boil ready to pop adds a bit of colour here and there, and the teal blue packmasters stand out well from the back, although these shots I've taken on a good example of that. The rat ogres have completely blocked them out, but somewhere lurking in the rear is Frot the Unclean, who I will show later in a separate shot. These amazing sculpts up next are of course the Poison Wind Globadiers, and I absolutely love these guys. They were a joy to paint. The musician in the middle is quite a rare sculpt called Venom Breath, and wasn't available for as long as the other 2 musicians in the set, so I was really pleased to acquire him and get him painted up to join this group of bright blue boys. I've played a couple of games with these guys, usually only 1 or 2 attached to my main block of Clanrats, and they've not done any good, but I'll persevere because they are just too cool to leave at home. So with that, I think that's all of the regiment section covered. So now I'm going to move on to the next section of the army book, which is War Machines. So first in this section is the bright yellow teams of Warpfire Throwers. I usually attach one of these to a regiment of Clanrats, and it's usually pretty good. No misfires or mishaps from them yet, but I know it's coming eventually. These were painted during the Middlehammer Tale painting challenge, and so I painted them quite quickly, with minimal highlights and a simple colour scheme to keep them quick and on schedule. Next is the mighty doomwheel, the second centrepiece to the army alongside the bell. I would love to paint another one of these one day and add it to the army because wow, are these great fun and really powerful in battle. I can only imagine the fear when your opponent sees you pull out not 1 doomwheel, but 2. The stuff of nightmares. I kept the paint job reasonably close to the studio effort, swapping a few colours about and opting for a glowing green prongs and generator rather than the red studio versions. I did have a go at the checker pattern on the top wheel to the side of the driver, and I did spend some time painting the rats inside the wheels before assembling it. Very glad I did, as it would have been a pain to do fully assembled, I'm sure. In the battles I've taken it to so far, it's been amazing fun, squashing loads of enemies with its impact hits, releasing bolts of lightning aplenty to zap everything around it, including a few Skaven as well, obviously. Even when the rider's died, it's still a dangerous tool if you keep it away from your own troops. I do need to find a way to keep track of wounds to the separate parts of the model though, and I probably should have magnetised the rider to make him removable upon death, but it seemed like too much work at the time. You've got to leave something to progress to for the future, I suppose. A unit of Jezzails, 3 of the teams being Colin Dixon sculpts. I've also included an earlier Jez sculpt with the skinnier rifle and Scref the Ironclad, who is a pretty iconic model amongst Skaven collectors. He's often used as a leader or a general character, but here in this army I thought he could lead this unit of Jezzails, which would give him a regular, more permanent home on the battlefield, and save him gathering dust on the shelf at home due to high competition for that general spot. In fact, you might have noticed I've used the pointy finger boys as unit leaders throughout this army for exactly that reason. I love all of them, and I want them all to have a place. I've got another unit of 4 Jezzails here that I can call upon if needed to expand the ranks of my other unit, or as a standalone unit in a larger game. I heard once of someone taking the full amount of Jezzails. I think that must be about 50 in a 3,000 point game, and I bet the Skaven general had a right laugh. I painted all of the Jezzails in one of the camo greens because they should be camouflaged. They are snipers, right? But then I remembered they are Skaven, so I gave them a bright red to yellow sort of fade on the arrows on the side of the gun, and a bright white cloaks and red accessories to tie them into the army. And that concludes the war machines because we've already covered the Screaming Bell. So next up, we've got the monsters section, which is pretty short and sweet for this army, consisting of just this unit of 3 rat swarms. They are the plastic Warhammer Quest rats of the mid-90s with 4 on a base, because 5, as the army book recommends, looked too packed in to me. I've not used these in a battle, so can't say too much about them. I'm sure they will be useful when I require some cheap chaff. So now we are on to the characters section. Where else to start other than the generals and warlords? So here we have on the far left a 2011 limited edition Games Day Skaven Warlord. He's obviously much later than most of the army, and although you can tell he isn't a Jez or a Colin sculpt, he just about gets away with it, I think, due to the very red era paint job I've gone for. I don't see him getting much use, but I wanted to have him in my collection and it seemed a shame not to paint him up. Next to him, at left centre, is Darkin the Storm Vermin Warlord. He was the first character that I painted for the army, and usually features as my general when I want him leading a unit of Clanrats, because he ranks up in that unit and no one else does. I swapped out his original triangular shield to match his unit, and he also has a place in my games of Warhammer Quest, which is where his name was acquired. He features in an old journal scenario, so I painted him up to one day play that out. Next to him, centre right, is what I call a 6th edition Warlord, who again I didn't necessarily see having a permanent home in the army, but he is a nice sculpt and I wanted him for the collection. It's always nice to have the option for some variety. You never know, Darkin might perish one day. Finally, far right is a classic Storm Vermin Warlord, whom I use when I want a general with a spear, or to lead my Storm Vermin. He's a really great sculpt and I couldn't be without him. So next up is the Army Battle Standard Bearers, or BSBs for short. Now from a gaming point of view, I've not used any of these guys yet because I just never seem to have enough points. I've only ever played up to 2,000 points so far in my short gaming career, so there is potential to get one of these guys involved when I get up to 2,500 points and upwards. The idea here is that I only use one of these BSB conversions depending on where I need him to be. On the left is a Clanrat BSB for the Clanrat units, if they require a BSB to join them. The guy on the right is if the Plague Monks require a BSB to join them, and the centre is for the Storm Vermin. or I can just use whichever as a free roaming BSB. I can't see that being a good tactic for the Skaven in 5th edition. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. All of these guys carry the same banner design because they won't ever be seen on the same battlefield, of course, but also because the only magic banner I wanted them to depict was the sacred standard of the Horned Rat. I like to try and keep all of my magic items and banners as thematic to the army I'm using as possible. Here we have a couple of Plague Priests, which usually live on the front rank of the Plague Monk units when I can afford to do so. I like to equip one of them with the Liber Bubonicus to basically turn them into a level 2 warlock that's frenzied like the Plague Monks, and carrying suitably plague-like items and spells, because the Liber allows them to potentially draw a Nurgle spell, something your opponent doesn't usually expect. Now we have the largest of the Skaven characters, the greater demon of the Horned Rat himself, the Vermin Lord. At 600 points, he's never been close to getting on the battlefield for me yet, but rest assured I'll be taking him out at the first opportunity I realistically get. He's such an iconic model from the 90s, having loads of adverts in White Dwarf with the memorable box art, and I'm sure loads of people owned him after seeing him on the shelves at their local Games Workshop stores. He's a great nostalgia hit and another great centrepiece for the army when, as I said, the points allow. I didn't stick to the studio scheme very strictly with this one, giving him a more modern warpstone glowing weapon and gems. He's got a very fancy collar on that I did in the army colours of red and white, and I put a little ratty friend on his base to keep him company and fill some of that 40mm base void. I haven't painted many large models, so it was good practice for me getting him done. I can only hope he serves me well in the future battles. Here we have all of my warlocks, including a couple from the front ranks of units earlier shown. I don't have any particular rule for which ones are engineers, champions or masters, but the one with a pointy finger and pistol in the centre does have the role of Quiric in my Warhammer Quest games. He was originally listed as a commander for Skaven war machine teams, but that position became defunct in the 4th edition army book, and so he now serves most people as a leader, or in my case, a warlock engineer. Although perhaps even a grey seer given those horns and a suitable paint job. The one with the bright green glowing staff I also have earmarked for the role of Wrath, whom is from the scenario in the journal I spoke about earlier alongside Darkin the Storm Vermin Warlord. Grey seers are shown here now with the classic Nordoom model on the left. I haven't used him yet, but painted him for an occasion where I wanted to maybe equip my Grey Seer with the magic item Poison Wind Globes, or when the magic items don't match up to the other sculpt carrying a sword and a staff. He's also much smaller and easier to rank up in some units. The Grey Seer on the right I've taken to every game I've played so far, and he's only turned into a Chaos Spawn once. Pretty good going for a greedy warpstone munching Skaven. I firmly believe you have to take a Grey Seer no matter what size game you're playing, because Andy Chambers said so in the book, and the only alternative being a Vermin Lord Greater Demon, but even then, I'd be tempted to take both and be a dominant magical force. We're getting to the end of the main characters section now, but next up we've got these 4 Skaven champions. Starting on the left, we've got the Butcher, featured earlier as part of his unit. Then we have his slightly more naked brother who holds aloft a spear, and a sharp tail, hence his name, Razor Tail. He's got an occasional place as a champion for the Clanrats Spearman unit, or he could potentially lead the slaves who also have spears. Third in the row is Warpie, who is called upon when the unit is equipped with extra hand weapons, like he is. And finally, on the right, Malice Manrak, aka Flench Packlord. I've no idea why he gets listed with different names, but he is basically a Skaven champion with a sword and shield, and so I can see him getting regular use in my Clanrat unit, who are armed in such the same way. Being slightly more armoured, he could also easily play the role of Chieftain, although that's a role I haven't found a use for in my army yet. It just seems a waste of time to spend the extra points, as I usually can't afford enough magic items for the characters that I've already got. 2 Storm Vermin champions is how these guys are usually classified, but if I take a unit of Storm Vermin, I don't because they're too expensive, but if I do, then these are often not required due to the presence of either my Warlord or a Grey Seer in the unit. They do make nice front rank models, however. One day I would like another copy of this model to try a conversion that I've thought about, where I give him a pointy finger so he can be like his fellow unit leading rat brothers. So with that, we are into the final section, and that is special characters. Here we have the famous duo, Little and Large, Tranquil and Bone Ripper. I actually painted these two up very recently for the Olden Demon painting competition. Now I obviously knew I wasn't going to win with my primitive painting techniques, but it was a great motivator to get him done, and it did wonders for my social media reach. Talking of which, if you made it this far, then you must have either fallen asleep or be enjoying the video, so either way, if you could do the like and subscribe YouTube things, I'd be most grateful. You can also see more pictures of this army on my Instagram and Facebook accounts, so I'll leave links in the description below. I kept relatively close to the studio paint job with these guys, only changing a few colours around to make them more readable, and in keeping with the rest of the army. I really tried to push the highlights on them and added the extra touches I learnt from reading all those heavy metal books as a child for the gems, weapons and horns. Here we have a Lord Skrolk, an absolute legend and one of the longest surviving sculpts ever created. Now, I didn't get too creative with the book like some people do, but I do feel it has that cartoony aesthetic to it that fits the rest of this army and that 90s vibe so well. He was painted quite a while ago now, and if I could have my time with him again, I'd probably paint on a few more details to his cloak, push the highlights a little bit further, maybe do something a bit more interesting with his flail, but he'll certainly pass for now. My Kit Claw features next, and he's probably my favourite of all the special characters. He actually features an entirely green stuffed backpack that I made from scratch. So a bit of an eBay rescue, I suppose, but I think it came out really well. I had a really hard time painting him, placing the colours, and it felt overwhelming at times, but I persevered and he actually turned out to be one of my favourite paint jobs in the army, despite not being technically brilliant or out of the ordinary. It just looks right to my eyes, and exactly captures how I wanted the entire army to be when I set out. Cartoony, bright, clean and punchy. Rot the Unclean is shown here now, finally visible without some of the rat ogres in the way. With his warpstone infused mancatcher, sword and eye, definitely a top 5 sculpt for me from this entire army. And this is another model I had an idea for to use as a Blood Bowl coach. I thought, what's more motivational to play a good game of American football than a coach waving an oversized spanner at your head? Another joy to paint and surprisingly simple. Still can't remember that teal that I used though. Deathmaster Snitch, the penultimate special character in this army, and like all of the other special characters, are yet to feature in a game. The Skaven army is, from what I've seen, already quite a force to be reckoned with, without the use of named characters that are notoriously overpowered in 4th and 5th edition generally. Now that's not to say I won't bring them for a bit of narrative fun, I just don't want to scare my opponents off. I painted Snitch quite closely to the studio scheme, but again steering away from the red drips on the sword for a more poison green to match the other rat boys. I also happened to own 2 of these guys after an eBay mishap, one of them missing his sword arm, which I replaced with a green stuff copy. So I now have the Snitch brothers, as it were. Another one of those situations where I can use one or both in Warhammer Quest as Deathmaster assassins, so the time spent on them isn't wasted. So that brings me to the final character, Queek the Head Taker. I can't wait to take this powerhouse out for a game against some dwarfs or orcs. Another great bit of fun to paint, but an absolute nightmare to rank up in a unit, and incredibly top and back heavy, so prone to falling over with only the slightest knock. But what an excellent model, and definitely one of my favourites. Great fun to paint. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed collecting and painting these little guys over the last few years. When I first started the project, I really wanted to document the progress on YouTube, one video at a time on a month by month basis, but I really struggled to find the time to paint and do all the video capturing and editing to keep up with both. I would like to try and document my next project a little bit better, so make sure you are subscribed to see all the latest videos from Dread Studios. I've got a huge backlog of other classic fantasy armies to get through, so join me on the journey. Thanks for watching and catch you in the next one.